So let's get started then. And I'm delighted that we are joined today by Hannah. And the last time I spoke with Hannah, I was looking this up earlier on. It was in September 2020, and it was almost 6 years ago now when we discussed your book, Erdogan Rising, The Battle for the Soul of Turkey. And I have my copy just behind me. And of course, your new book, which we're going to talk about today, Hinterlands. I picked up my copy yesterday at Monroe's Books here in Victoria. And when it comes to Erdogan Rising, the talk that we did back in 2020, it's had over 500 views on our CIC national YouTube channel, which is actually pretty good. But today our focus is on Hinterlands, the new Cold War brewing at the peripheries of the West. And it does, I mean, I'm started reading it now and I'm really, really enjoying it. It gives you a look at places that we don't often talk about, Nagorno-Karabakh, the Transnistria, Bosnia, the Republika Srpska, the breakaway enclaves of in Georgia of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. They show up as well, Crimea and so on. And for those of you that don't know, Hannah is a consultant and reporter for The Times and The Economist. She's a consistent Pulitzer grantee, and she's contributed to the Atlantic, Monocle, Wired, the Times Literary Supplement, among other publications. And until recently, was based in Istanbul, having moved there in 2013, but now in London. And one thing we share in common, Hannah, is that when you arrived in Istanbul, I was down the road in Ankara at the Canadian Embassy, and responsible for many of the areas that places that you talk about in your book. I had kept an eye on Syria, of course, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. As the military attaché, I was accredited to Georgia, and so I had my eye on South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So I find the book absolutely fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. So welcome to our CIC talk. So I have a question for you about your book. And I recently listened to a conversation you had with William Armstrong, his Turkey book talks, which I really love. And his first question was, what triggered you to write this book about places that are often seen as oddities and geopolitical sideshows? So I thought we could start with that. What was the inspiration for Hinterlands?
Sure. Well, I mean, thank you very, very much for having me back. It's lovely to be back with the CIC talking with you again. So yeah, I mean, you'll know this, Chris, and you alluded to it in your introduction. The gorgeous thing about being based in Turkey, and particularly in Istanbul, which is, a major air transport hub. The great thing about being based there as a journalist is that you have access to this really wide geographical region, which is very, very diverse. People talk about Istanbul particularly, but Turkey more broadly is the kind of bridge between East and West. But actually, when you spend any amount of time there, you realize that actually it's not just a bridge between two places, it's a center point between a lot of different places. You've got obviously Europe to the west. To the east, you've got the Caucasus, Iran. You go down a bit further south, you've got the Middle East, Iraq, Syria. You go north, you've got the Black Sea, you've got the former Soviet Union. So it borders this really diverse range of places. And from Istanbul you can get to all these places quickly and not now so much anymore, like everywhere, more than most places. Actually, Turkey's afflicted by inflation, but certainly when I first moved there, very cheaply as well. For I think some flights you could get sort of 15 quid going to Cyprus and places like that. So, I moved there as a freelance journalist, kind of trying my luck. And obviously Turkey is fascinating. But I also wanted to see as many of these kind of places around Turkey as I could. I'd actually already spent quite a bit of time in the Balkans. Kosovo was the first place that I ever went to as a foreign correspondent.
Mhm.
That was back in 2007. So it was while Kosovo was still not a kind of state or sovereign nation state. It was before it declared independence. Um, and yeah, that's very, very close, that region from Istanbul as well. But also, as you mentioned, Nagorno-Karabakh in the Caucasus, going east, going north, places like Crimea, Transnistria. And, the fascination of the places that I bring together in Hinterlands initially for me was just their weirdness, actually. The thing that links this very diverse set of places is that they're all grey zones, disputed territories, places where borders haven't really been, finally decided, where there's disputes over who these territories belong to, what state they're part of. Um, and that leads to some quite kind of interesting scenarios on the ground. So if you take the case of, for example, Transnistria, which is in one sense part of Moldova, which in itself is a post-Soviet state. Transnistria is a region within Moldova that didn't want to be part of Moldova. In the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, mainly Russian speaking rather than Moldovan speaking. At that time, it wanted to actually rejoin the Soviet Union. Of course, the Soviet Union in not too much time was no longer, but it's kept all the kind of aesthetics of the Soviet Union. You go there and there are still statues of Lenin. There's still kind of these amazing like Soviet mosaics and sort of all this ephemera of the Soviet Union. And up until quite recently, it was a bit of a tourist destination. Certainly when I went there, it was really interesting. To get there, you get what's called a marshutka, which is like a little decrepit public minibus from Chisinau, which is the Moldovan capital. And you get in that and you go for about an hour, and then you get to the de facto border. And there's some sort of very surly Transnistrian border guards who look at papers and rubber stamps and things and then give you a visa for a certain amount of time. Um, and you go in, and the people who are in that marshutka with me, there were mainly tourists. I remember there were some guys actually who worked at the British Embassy in Warsaw. They weren't diplomats, they were sort of in the sort of visa consulate section. And they were just interested. They had some time off and wanted to go and see it. And it became the place where I stayed actually was it was like this faithfully restored Soviet era apartment. And the guy who ran it was an American guy who had some kind of Transnistrian heritage. And I was asking him, who do you see here? He's like, well, a lot of people who just want cheap beer,
Mhm.
sort of like Soviet nostalgia types. When I went in 2019, the HBO series Chernobyl hadn't long been broadcast. So there'd been this kind of like boom of Soviet nostalgia tours off the back of that. And obviously it sort of a few years before the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. Pickup artists as well. Apparently,
Mhm.
he saw quite a few of those. They used to sort of come because, famously the women of that region are very beautiful. Don't think they're particularly impressed with men coming and trying their luck with them.
Mhm.
Yeah, at first it was just kind of, the opportunity of going to these places quite easily, and also just like a fascination with seeing them. What made me want to write the book? I mean, the kind of the big bang, I guess, was the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, which sort of really brought into sharp relief this new conflict in Europe. In the book, I term it the new Cold War, but actually, it's not a Cold War anymore. It's turned hot in a lot of places. But it was certainly at that point like a Cold War building up, and this sort of continent-wide clash between Vladimir Putin's Russia on one side and various allied states such as Belarus, and then on the other side, broadly and imperfectly, the West. So mainly sort of gathered around two alliances, which is the European Union and NATO, although there are states within both that are sometimes problematic, let's say. But yeah, towards the end of the 2010s, I started realizing when I was going to these places that they weren't just oddities anymore or post-conflict states. They were actually part of this bigger story that was developing in Europe.
Right. Yeah, because I think in what you see in many of these places is actually clash between Russia and Turkey over many of well, certainly in Syria, because I know you spend a lot of time in the book speaking about what happened in Syria, right up to the fleeing of Bashar al-Assad in December 2024, which was not a surprise, but a surprise. And elsewhere, Crimea, of course, between Russia and Turkey because of Turkish interests. And what we see with Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia and Azerbaijan, it seems that there's a real tussle for influence throughout the area that you're speaking, and including Bosnia as well. Um, who's got the upper hand these days?
It's a very good question. So yeah, the reason why start the book in Syria, Syria is chapter one of Hinterlands, is because, well, there's two reasons. First of all, as you mentioned, it was a major theatre of the quite strange, sometimes competition, sometimes kind of, what's the right word? Codependency? No, that's not the right word. Cooperation to a degree,
Hmm.
so under the surface cooperation between Turkey and Russia, or more accurately, I would say between Tayyip Erdogan and Vladimir Putin. The second reason was because the argument that I make is Syria was the place where this new Cold War really kind of burst into the open. 2011 Damascus. And the reason for that is Syria was the place where Putin really felt empowered enough and strongly enough to openly oppose what the West was doing. And Syria, I mean, you will know very well, very, very quickly descended from a civil war into a proxy war
Hmm.
within the space of a year, really. Putin and Iran came in really heavily on the side of Bashar al-Assad. And on the side of the opposition, it was more messy because the opposition was messy. There were so many different factions in that. But, certainly, Western countries like the UK, the US, France, Canada, definitely backed the political opposition, backed to differing degrees and at different times, and with different amounts of commitment, the armed opposition as well. Turkey, of course, was one of the staunchest backers of the armed opposition, along with Qatar. And yeah, this was the place where you saw that kind of rift open up fully and grow. It was also the place where you saw, the increasing use of various weapons of war, which have become very, very commonplace now, principally sanctions. That was sort of in the beginning, I would have said sort of tried not very successfully against Assad. He was sanctioned almost from the off, to various degrees. It wasn't really until the Caesar sanctions, which came in I think 2019 or 2020, that he really got hit hard. And it was interesting, going to Syria after the fall of Assad. I went there a couple of months after he was deposed in February 2025, and I asked quite a lot of people about the effect of those sanctions, and whether they thought that they'd played a role in sort of finally bringing Assad down. And it actually took me from being quite a sanctions cynic to thinking, okay, there is something in this, because people said, okay, yes, like we were affected extremely badly. Those Caesar sanctions, the reason why they were called the Caesar sanctions is because they were in response to a huge tranche of evidence, handed over to the US by a regime defector who was given the code name Caesar. He's since sort of revealed his identity. He was a regime policeman, and he'd collected tens of thousands of photographs of torture, murder, everything that was happening in Assad's prisons. It was, that was the point where it became undeniable. Right, there was plenty of testimony and evidence before that, but that was the kind of final thing. And several years after that, these very heavy sanctions were brought in, which basically made it. I mean, it basically cut Syria off from the world
Hmm.
financially. And even when I went, I mean, you couldn't, the banks still weren't connected. You couldn't use credit cards or anything like that. Everything was in cash. I couldn't even look at my banking app on my phone when I was there. You couldn't even open it. You couldn't sort of update any software or anything like that. And people said, yeah, it did affect us badly. We still saw that Assad was, living in luxury in his palace. However, this is where they worked. When it came to it, his soldiers just didn't want to defend him because
All right.
that gap had become so wide. That I think the equivalent, for normal soldiers, they were on about $10 a month by that point. So even the Alawite officers, they were just like, yeah, no way.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but yeah, coming back to your question in a very sort of long-winded way, um, up until December 2024, Putin definitely had the upper hand in that relationship between him and Erdogan, and certainly in Syria. So what you had happening increasingly from sort of, yeah, 2020 onwards, there was a sort of détente between Turkish and Russian forces, both of which were present on the ground. Actual Turkish soldiers were inside Syria. And there were occasions actually when Turkish soldiers were killed by Russian jets. It was sort of very well covered up in Turkey because there's almost complete control of the media there. But a couple of instances where there was quite a big loss of life of Turkish soldiers.
Mhm.
And it really came down to in Syria, okay, Erdogan had some presence on the ground. He had strength through, backing certain factions which were very well embedded in on the ground in certain parts of the country, but Russia controlled the skies. It was as simple as that, right? So anything that Erdogan wanted to do in Syria, he sort of had to have Putin's approval to do it.
Right.
And from Syria, you saw this weird relationship play out again and again in other theatres. So you saw it in Libya. In Libya again, the Tripoli government, backed by Turkey, also backed by the West, and then in the east, the government, the rival government of Khalifa Hiftar, a sort of ex-Gaddafi type, backed by Russia, and clashing, and then sort of sorting it out because things go on behind the scenes. Again in Nagorno-Karabakh,
Mhm.
um, you know, Azerbaijan backed hugely by Turkey. It's one probably the closest foreign relationship that Turkey's got. Certainly the closest that Azerbaijan's got. Armenia, had always sort of seen Russia as its kind of guarantor there. But again, things went on behind the scenes when it came to the Azerbaijani attack in 2023. The Russian peacekeepers just kind of stood back and did nothing. Um, Really, the fall of Bashar al-Assad, which again, I mean, the really startling thing about that was that Russia really did nothing to stop it. Those rebels started advancing right in November 2024. And first they went into Aleppo, and we were all thinking they're just going to get bombed to oblivion by the Russians because that's always what happened before. And the Russians for a few days they did some sort of cursory bombing here and there, but they just weren't doing anything to stop the advance. Um, Now there's been various sort of theories posited as to why that is. Obviously, um, 2 and a bit, well, nearly 3 years previously, Putin had launched his invasion of Ukraine, thinking that it was going to be a sort of done deal in a matter of weeks. That hadn't happened. He'd got bogged down. He'd also, by that time, Nagorno-Karabakh had been, gone back to Azerbaijan, lost influence there. The Bosphorus Strait had been closed to his warships. Up until that happened, that was as a result of the invasion of Ukraine as well. Up until that, if you lived in Istanbul, weekly you would see Russian warships going back and forth between the Black Sea port in Crimea and in Sevastopol and the Russian port in Tartus in Syria, and that was completely cut off.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, certainly since then, I mean, it's really in the Middle East, the fall of Bashar al-Assad has really sort of restacked the deck in Erdogan's favor big time.
Yeah.
I mean, that new government there in Damascus, it was fascinating. I mean, clearly the Turks have had massive influence over the years with Ahmed al-Sharaa, the new president, and with the group that he ran. That goes back years and years and years to the start of the Civil War almost. But also in the kind of cabinet that he appointed. If you look at many of the ministers and kind of district governors, they're all come from Turkish universities. They've all
Mhm.
got links to Turkey, in some cases
Mhm.
speaking fluent Turkish. The Turkey's spy chief is a guy called Ibrahim Kalin. He was in Damascus in a matter of days after the fall of
Right.
Bashar al-Assad. Their embassy was reopened within, I mean, it was open again by the time I went there in February.
Mm.
Whereas the Brits, for example, are still umming and ahhing about what to do. They're still running their Syria operation from Beirut. Um, so yeah, I mean, I certainly wouldn't say that Sharar is, purely Turkey's puppet, but certainly that's a very, very close relationship.
Mhm.
And it's definitely kind of, yeah, sort of redrawn the lines in the Middle Eastern sands in Erdogan's favor.
So one of the places that you speak about is in the book is the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, and I spent a week there when I was in Ankara. We flew down and stayed in a very nice resort, and it's a really very nice part of Cyprus, but you get into it in far more detail than I did, traveling to both sides of the line, visiting the Green Line. It's a fascinating place, really. It seems a land that time forgot in many ways, because not many people do go there. What were some of the interesting things that struck you about the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus when you were spending time there?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I landed there because I had to, right? I went to Cyprus. Yeah, really, really early on in my time in Turkey, probably in the summer of 2013. And if you're flying from Turkey, the only place that you can fly to is in the north. It's to I've complete Ercan Airport. Sorry, the name escaped me there. Ercan Airport in the north, which has recently been rebuilt. But yeah, because Turkey has no relations with the Greek side, the Republic of Cyprus. That's because of the war in 1974, which split the island. Um, so in the north, you have an entity which calls itself, yeah, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. Um, it declared its own sovereignty in 1983. It's never been recognized by anybody apart from Turkey. That's the reason why, if you want to fly into Ercan, you have to do it from Turkey. There's nowhere else in the world that you can fly into there from. But I was actually heading to the south that first time because I was doing a story about refugees. And yeah, I was going to meet a lawyer in the south, and I was actually quite naive. I didn't really know too much about Cypriot history, so I landed at this airport, and then you kind of get on the airport bus and go into the centre of the city, and then I sort of remember going to a taxi driver and saying, "Can you take me to this place?" And he looked at me like I was really stupid, which of course I was, and he was like, "That's on the other side." And I was like, "Oh." And he's like, you need to go through the border. So then I sort of like traipsed off. And it is literally a border. It cuts directly through the capital of Cyprus. It's called Nicosia on the Greek side, and it's called Lefkosia on the Turkish side.
Mhm.
And I mean, if you have certainly a British passport or an EU passport, probably a Canadian passport as well, it's a matter of 30 seconds to get from one side to the other because you just sort of go to the booth on whatever side you're on, you show your passport, they look at it, they hand it back, you walk a few seconds, and then they do the same on the other side. You might get your bag checked depending on what day it is and what mood they're in and how dodgy you look. And that's it. And you literally go, if you're going from the north to the south, you go from, like you say, like it's almost like this land that time forgot. It's actually quite charming in
Mhm.
Lefkosia, at least in the very center of it, because actually for a long time on the Turkish side of the line, that very center of the city was abandoned directly after the war. A lot of the original families escaped. They went to live in other places, either outside Cyprus or elsewhere in Cyprus. It was inhabited by very poor migrants for a long time, but recently, in the sort of past 10 years, it's had quite a bit of a revival, and a lot of the beautiful old Cypriot houses have been, renovated and turned into boutique hotels and bars and art spaces, and it's very, very nice and just rustic and yeah, just nice vibe, right? But very kind of shabby chic, I guess.
Mhm.
And then you go through the border and you're in the EU, and it's suddenly a lot flashier and a lot more. I mean, it's not a high rise kind of, mega city by any means, but certainly like you feel the difference. And if you can get up high enough, there are a few spots on either side where, sort of housing blocks where if you can sneak in the stairwell and get up to the top, you
Mhm.
can get a bird's eye view and you can literally see it's called the Green Line that divides them. And the difference, it's like a sepia photo on one side and a Technicolor on the other. It's astounding, absolutely astounding. Um, but so yeah, so that was my first kind of experience with Cyprus. And once I'd done that assignment and I'd gone back, I knew I wanted to go back and sort of explore the north some more.
Mhm.
Um, both both as a journalist because I found it very interesting. Again, this place that on the map doesn't exist that had all kind of, you know, problems that come with that. Not just that if you want to fly in there that you have to go through Turkey. And actually, because there's so many Turkish Cypriots in Britain, I don't know if this is still the case now, but there were some flights from Britain, and the way that they got round it was they would literally fly and just like touch down in Antalya and then take straight off again and land in Cyprus,
Mm.
right? And
Yeah.
there is a consulate of the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus in the UK as well.
I've seen it. I saw the flag outside the building.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it might be the only one in the world. I'm not sure. Maybe someone can correct me on that. But yeah, I mean that's about the sort of, the diaspora that we have here. But also, I mean, the other reason why I just loved exploring the North is because it was really unspoiled compared to the South. And again, that's a function of it being unrecognized because, no big international developer or international company is gonna go and invest their money there because you're putting your money into a black hole,
Yeah.
basically. I mean, it's not sanctioned in the way that, for example, annexed Crimea is sanctioned. It's just embargoed,
Mhm.
right? Like if you want to sort of put money in there, like you have to sort of go through this system of going through sort of Turkish attendant banks and things like that.
Mhm.
So it's a sort of difficult place to work, but that meant that it wasn't overdeveloped in the way that the South really is. I mean, I hope no Greek Cypriots are going to be really angry with me, but there's parts of the south that have been just utterly ruined. Like you think of
Mm.
places like Ayia Napa and places like that.
All right.
But the north, you find these gorgeous wildernesses, particularly the Carpats, which is a sort of panhandle of Cyprus. It's beautiful. It's an absolute wilderness. So yeah, that was kind of what attracted me
Mhm.
there. But again, I just realized really after the Crans Montana talk. So this was in 2017. This was a UN-backed crack at some kind of reunification deal. Um, and everyone was quite hopeful about it. At the time, you had leaders on both sides who were sort of quite amenable to talking. They'd gone on this sort of very symbolic joint walk along the Green Line. They were talking and getting on quite well.
Mhm.
And it ended in nothing. The Crans-Montana talks just broke down.
Mhm.
And after that, then there were huge rows about the ownership of gas that had been discovered around Cyprus. Erdogan started really kind of using the north for kind of, jingoism at home, really. Cyprus is one of these issues back in Turkey that you can stoke it quite easily. There's quite sort of, you know, strident sentiments about Cyprus, even though most Turks have actually never been there and it doesn't really feature much in the news generally.
No.
So yeah, so again, I sort of realized that it was becoming a kind of current story and not just a kind of quirky historical story.
Yeah, I think for Canadian Cyprus is front and center because we sent peacekeepers there in 1964 at the very
Yeah.
beginning of trouble. Um, we had a large presence there for a long time. We we over the last while we've only had one officer as part of the UN force there just to keep that relationship going with Cyprus. But I just read yesterday that we're taking away that last person from Operation Snow Goose. So our long record of peacekeeping on the island will come to an end. One of the things, though, that struck me that comes from the book, because all the places we're talking about are, in essence, countries, right? Transnistria, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, Abkhazia, South Ossetia. They have parliaments and presidents and flags. And in some cases, they're recognized by others as countries. And I read in your book that Abkhazia had at one point opened up an embassy in Syria. So
Yeah.
these countries exist, and there are many others we could talk about. Somaliland, I know that's not in the book, and we can talk about 100 different places in the world that sort of sit in these gray areas. But of course, the ones that you're focused on are in very challenging places. But they exist as countries, and I think to me this was it's like a whole other world that and then of course people take advantage of the fact that they're in this gray zone because you speak about cryptocurrency farms in Transnistria, uh, human smuggling, drug smuggling, and I was kind of shocked to read that in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus there are 20 casinos
Yeah.
as well. So um, in the case of that, why would, for example, the Turkish government, which obviously plays a big role in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, turn a blind eye to something that they won't allow in their own country? What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a very useful pressure valve, right? Because Turks love gambling and gambling is banned in Turkey. It's been banned, I think it was actually banned just before Erdogan came in, but of course, he's an Islamist, so and by the way, Turks do gamble more than any other nation. I've seen far more than I've seen Brits gamble. They're all sort of doing it online. And there is a sort of weird legalized betting where you can't win much money, and there is a national lottery and things like that. But yeah, I mean, gambling in casinos is completely banned. So it's a
Hmm.
very useful pressure valve, because Turks they either go to North Cyprus or they go to Batumi in Georgia. These are the two kind of nearest places, absolutely full of Turks. But also, I mean, in every other level, to have it as this kind of black hole, um, is very, very useful. I mean, it's a very useful sink for dirty Turkish money, for money laundering. There's no end of stories in the time that I was in Turkey about, Turkish mobsters in Cyprus. There was, I can't remember his name for the life of me, but there was one who was assassinated in Cyprus in quite a famous, mobland killing.
Hmm.
Um, Also, I won't name any names at all, but sort of people close to the government, who might have some kind of ill-gotten gains. It's a very, very
Right.
useful place to go and launch that. The person who I do talk about in the book, who's very famous in Britain, I'm not sure about Canada, is a guy called Asl Nadir. So Asl Nadir, I just remember him from my childhood. He was in the 1980s and early 1990s, like the big. It was him and Robert Maxwell were like the two big British businessmen. Um, so Asl Nadir, he was a Turkish Cypriot. Um, his father had decided in 1960, when Cyprus gained independence from the British Empire, that they should keep their British citizenship, which was an option. And when not long after that, the island kind of descended into conflict, they came to London. His father was a successful businessman. He restarted his businesses here in the East End of London. And Asl Nadir, who was a young man at the time, sort of he had a big row with his father, and he decided to set up on his own. And he bought a kind of fading fashion house. It's called Polypec. And exactly the moment that Margaret Thatcher did her big bang of the economy, the deregulation of the city. And he fully took advantage of that. He turned this small fashion house into a huge global conglomerate. And he was like Mr. 80s London, right? He donated loads of money to the Tories. Yeah, I met him shortly before he died, and he sort of proudly showed me this letter that he had from Thatcher. He was hanging out with Princess Margaret. He was
Hmm.
buying, racehorses. Um, and then it all came crashing down. The Serious Fraud Office launched an investigation into him in 1990. It turned out that he'd been doing some sort of magic with the books. Corporate governance in those days was not as strong as it is now. Some people say it's still not strong enough in Britain,
Hmm.
but the reason why we have the kind of rules that we have now is as a result of Asl Nadir and Robert Maxwell and what they did. Um, but he was up on some very serious charges. What did he do? He found a private jet and a pilot, and he did a runner to North Cyprus
Hmm.
with his money. And there he remained for the next 17 years. Prosecutors here just couldn't get near him because it is a black hole. What stick do you have as an administrator or as a government to beat a country that's not part of your system anyway? You have none, right?
Right.
So he remained there for 17 years. He came back to Britain voluntarily in 2010. There are different theories about why he did that. He didn't really give me a straight answer when I asked him, but probably because we had a Conservative government again, and he probably thought he was going to get an easy ride. He didn't. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served two or three, no, sorry. He served four of those in Britain. Yeah. He served two of those in Belmarsh, which is our sort of harshest prison. It's where, sort of terrorist support and extremely violent criminals. And then there was a deal done with Turkey.
Mhm.
And he was taken back to Turkey where he was meant to serve the rest of his sentence, which of course he didn't. He served one night and then he went home to North Cyprus in a limousine. And when I went to interview him there several years later, I mean, he was still living in some pretty, well padded surroundings, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
because, and in fact, the administration of his company was only wound up in 2019. It was in administration for about 3 decades. They never got close to recovering those assets. Never got close.
To the regions, the dark, these black holes of these particular countries, doesn't it? And for the audience, and I, I do see we have some questions that have come in, and if anybody has questions for Hannah, please do that. I'll get to some of them in a second. I wanted to just quickly focus on Azerbaijan and Armenia because I think it was September 2023 when Azerbaijan recaptured territories that they'd lost in the 90s when fighting Armenia, and that included Nagorno-Karabakh. As horrible as all that has been, because there were refugees on both sides, right? I mean, when I went to Baku, there were still Azeris living in pretty shabby housing and waiting for something to happen. And of course, more recently, you saw the people heading back to Armenia from Nagorno-Karabakh in their cars in these long lineups. But since the recapture of the territory, things seem to be on the mend. Um, am I right in thinking that things are on the mend in the region?
I think diplomatically, politically, yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you say, this didn't happen without a huge human cost. On both sides, in the 1990s when that war was going on and that territory was originally taken by an ethnic Armenian administration, a huge amount of Azerbaijani refugees fled and left everything behind, lived in pretty appalling conditions mostly around Baku. And then in 2020 and 2023, when Azerbaijan took back the territory, of course, the same thing happens in reverse. There was between, I think, about 120,000 Armenian refugees, pretty much all in one go, just fled that territory. Um, so, what I'm about to say is not to diminish the human cost. But diplomatically and politically, the interesting thing about Turkey-Armenia relations is people always assume that the reason why they were terrible is because of what happened in 1915 and the Armenian genocide. It's not. It was because of Nagorno-Karabakh. It was because of what was happening in the early 1990s and when that original Armenian administration took control of that territory that Turkey closed its borders and shut off its diplomatic relations with Armenia. That was in solidarity with Azerbaijan. And as a result of that, everything that kind of grew up in that region, which although it's a sort of like lesser known region, probably not many people have been there. It's not massively reported on in the news. It's pretty central. I mean, definitely in terms of kind of transport corridors, it's bang on China's middle corridor of its Belt and Road scheme. If you look at the flight paths since the outbreak of the war in Iran, um, basically because, Russia's pretty much a no-fly zone for Western flights now, so is Iran. And because the Gulf has become increasingly problematic, you'll see that many, many flights, in fact, almost all flights going from Europe eastwards are going through like the eye of a needle in that bit of territory. It's like you've got Iran to the south and you've got Russia to the north, and then you've got Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia here, and all these flights are going through there. It's absolutely fascinating. Um, but yeah, I mean, before 2023, there were sort of several logistical routes forged through that region in the couple of decades after the breakup of the Soviet Union. There were gas pipelines because obviously Azerbaijan is petrochemicals rich. There was gas discovered under the Caspian Sea in the 90s, pipeline coming out to Turkey, going to a port called Ceyhan on the Mediterranean coast. And just looking at it geographically, the logical way to do that would be to go like directly west. But because of Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenian territory, you couldn't do that. So the line sort of like loops up and it goes through Georgia, it ostentatiously cuts out Armenia and then goes through Turkey. And the same thing with the rail route. It's called the Kars Tbilisi Baku line. And in fact, now it goes to Ankara as well. Again, it sort of goes like that and cuts out Armenia. Now, because Nagorno-Karabakh has changed hands, it's ended in a victory for Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is happy. Turkey is also happy. It's sort of laid that to bed. And you've seen a real kind of growth of diplomatic ties between Turkey and Armenia. And there sort of wasn't even any discussion about it. It was like both were sort of ready and raring to go. There'd been some sort of signs of openings already, like flights had started between Istanbul and Yerevan, the Armenian capital. But now they're talking about, opening the land border. I think in the coming years, we're probably going to see more kind of direct rail routes. Obviously, Trump, he's got his
Mm.
interests as well. He came in last summer to oversee the sort of final peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and part of that was, what's it called? The TRIP project. I can't remember exactly what it stands for.
I know.
It's
Trump
Trump.
wrote for
There we go.
international peace and prosperity.
There you go. What a name. Yeah, so this is a big old road that's going to go along exactly these new kind of transport lines. America stands to make a huge amount of money out of it, or American contractors do. Um, and I think, for both sides, there are obvious gains. I mean, Armenia is still quite a desperately poor country. You go to Yerevan and it looks quite gilded. It's a very beautiful city. It's lovely. It's sort of built
Mm.
of this sort of pinky stone. It's quite sort of grand in that very Soviet way. And there's been an influx of Russian money since 2022, like a lot of Russians escaping conscription where else have gone to Yerevan. So there's a sort of gilded feel to Yerevan, but you go just outside and you see how poor it is. So any kind of trade links I think would be hugely helpful. Potential for Armenia to turn into some kind of logistics hub. Obviously, Armenia as well has swiveled away from Russia since 2023 and more towards the West. And obviously, Turkey, while it is not, let's say, a perfect ally, is part of NATO and is
Mm.
sort of broadly part of that Western camp. So yeah, I think sort of diplomatically, it's sort of put to bed quite a, illogical and nonsensical situation that you had in that region for a long time.
Yeah, definitely. It just talks to the whole region how it shifts so much. And I'm going to turn to a couple of audience questions. Frank Arnold, he's focused on Al-Shara and what's happening in Syria. And of course, another hinterland, if you like, was Rojava, the
Mm.
Kurdish region, right,
Yes,
in
yeah.
Syria. Um, I guess what Frank is saying, Al-Shara appears to be moderate, almost Western in some respects, but is this real? Is he going to become another Bashar al-Assad down the road, or is there real change ongoing in Syria right now?
That's a great question, and that's a debate that journalists are having, between us academics. So this is very much my view, and if you talk to other journalists and people who look at Syria, they all might disagree with you. My view is leopards don't change their spots that easily. Um, I see Shara as an arch pragmatist. I said that to somebody a couple of weeks ago, a Syria expert, and she got very angry with me
Mhm.
and didn't like it at all. But I guess my view is coloured by the fact that I reported in Syria throughout the conflict from the rebel-held areas, and of course Ahmed al-Sharaa, the group that he was leader of, was latterly known as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Before that, was known as Jabhat al-Nusra, which was it was Al Qaeda in Syria. They were the Al Qaeda franchise. They came in, they did an enormous amount of damage to the opposition. I mean, I don't want to sound kind of like misty-eyed and naive about Syria, but in those very early protests against Bashar al-Assad, they were sort of lawyers, academics, intellectuals, students, people who wanted democracy. then, of course, it descended into civil war. And as this isn't something that's unique to Syria or the Middle East. When you have a conflict breaking out, who's going to rise to the top? It's not going to be your nice, bookish liberals, right? It's going to be your dudes who know how to use guns and are willing to use guns.
Mm.
So, what happened at first was, the sort of first armed factions were basically sort of people from the countryside with hunting rifles, and then joined by defectors from the army who brought weapons caches with them, things like that. But then very quickly got overtaken by these Islamist groups, the forefront of which was Ahmed al-Shara's Jabhat al-Nusra for a while until ISIS came in and proved themselves to be even nastier.
Yeah.
Uh, but Jabhat al-Nusra were nasty. I mean, we feared these guys in places like Aleppo. As a Western journalist, we did our utmost to avoid them, to avoid being seen by them. They never gave interviews to us, like at
Mm.
all. They kidnapped people, both Syrians and foreigners. There was a huge amount of movement of fighters between Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS because they're basically the same ideology. There's a court case ongoing in the UK in civil courts, which is actually against the state of Qatar and the Qatar National Bank for funding Jabhat al-Nusra. And the claimants, who are all Syrians, are bringing that case on the basis that they were tortured, deprived of their property, had to leave the country. They committed war crimes. I mean, it's as simple as
Mhm.
that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, Sharar clearly is a smart, pragmatic man who knew what he had to do in order to get the backing that he needed to do what he did, which was depose Assad. From a Western point of view, it was very clear that Assad was a far bigger problem, and Iran actually, I say Assad, actually more broadly Iran and Iran's kind of influence in the Levant was a far bigger problem, at least for now, than Shara was going to be, particularly if Shara could be persuaded to stay on side,
Mhm.
which clearly he could be. It was very, very interesting going to Syria in February 2025, because, whenever I'd reported inside rebel-held Syria in areas that Sharar and his men controlled, there would be absolutely no way that I could go around with my head uncovered, or that I could be wearing sort of, clothes which showed any of my shape at all. I'd have to sort of swathe myself in, you know,
Mhm.
shadows almost. And so it was very odd. I mean, Damascus is still, a place where you have to sort of dress it. So to a degree, you have to sort of, follow local customs. But I could quite happily, in front of Shiraz men, be there wearing jeans and a t-shirt with my hair uncovered. And you can sort of it's far easier to change the mind of someone like Shara than it is of his men, who by and large are quite uneducated, often brutalized, probably have lost members of their family.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
now being told, well, this is how we are now. They certainly didn't give me any hassle. And I've never heard of any journalists, actually, Western journalists, being given any hassle. But I mean, you just have to look at what happened in March 2025 up in Latakia with the revenge attacks against Alawite communities there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, um, do I think in his sort of heart and soul has he changed? No, I don't. I think he's I think he's pragmatic. I think he's very smart. I've heard little bits and pieces coming out of Syria about sort of they're things that sound quite trivial when I say them, but you put them together and they're not, because I saw the same thing happening in Syria under the Islamist groups in the rebel-held areas. So things like, banning bikinis on public beaches, things like starting to harass tourists who are trying to leave the country with like bottles of Syrian wine and things like that. It sounds very, very minor,
Mhm.
but I know from experience that this is how it starts,
Right.
right?
Right. Right. Gotcha.
So, I think there are things holding Shara in place right now. He needs America because he needs money. He needs investment. he needs strong allies. Syria is still in a difficult region. One of the really interesting things about the Middle East since the outbreak of the attacks against Iran in February and still continuing now is that Syria is like the most studiously neutral
Mm,
state.
mm,
Just like we've had enough. We're sitting this one out. Trump did try and bring Sharar into the fight against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and he sort of refused to do that, which is smart. But yeah, I mean, he cannot afford for sort of, new sectarian violence on a large scale to be breaking out in that
mm,
country.
mm. I know our hour's coming to an end, and there is a question from Susan, and it's about Israel and Turkey, because this is a very tenuous relationship. Um,
Right.
Best of times, we know what happened in Gaza. We know what happened with Hezbollah and the exploding pagers. We know about the rhetoric that comes out of Ankara directed at Israel. Um, do you think these are two countries that would come to fisticuffs, that would actually clash in the open, or is there more to the story behind the scenes?
I think it would be pretty cataclysmic for both of them, actually. I mean, Turkey is a NATO member.
Hmm.
If Israel was to unilaterally attack Turkey, Article 5 dictates that NATO would have to come to Turkey's support, um, which would put a lot of NATO members in a very difficult position. But I mean, probably you have a sort of more educated opinion than me on this, Chris. I think they would. I think Turkey is far too valuable an ally within NATO at the moment. Um,
Yeah. But it seems
to
to me the Turks are very pragmatic about these things too. While the rhetoric is quite high, we often know that intelligence ties and
Right.
economic ties, and it's sort of it's a question that another one that Frank had, um, was the fact that Turkey is so adept at playing off both
Yeah.
sides. You can go back to Ismet Inonu in the Second World War, and I often bring him up to, today, where we see President Erdogan so very cleverly cooperating with NATO, helping Ukraine, but happily welcoming all millions of Russian tourists to the country every year. Um, Maybe we can end on that, because you lived in Istanbul for over a decade. You've relocated. You must be missing some things by now of about Istanbul, or maybe happy about other things. Um, let's just sort of talk about that. Why did you decide it was time to leave Istanbul?
Oh, it was an accumulation of things, really. I mean, I've been there a very long time, as you say. And the thing is, when you're a journalist and you stay in a place for too long, you start finding yourself doing the same stories again and again and again. And I do think there's a sweet spot as a foreign correspondent. It's interesting, like some newspapers will have a set length of posting for their correspondents. The
Mhm.
Financial Times does this. I think it's like 3 or 4 years, and then you have to move on somewhere else. Whereas others will just let you stay indefinitely. And I do think there is a sweet spot because obviously, whenever you move to a new country, it's not just learning the language, it's learning everything, especially with a country as complicated as Turkey. And that doesn't happen quickly. I mean, it takes a lot of just being in the country, talking to a lot of people, reading a lot, studying a lot. It's not something that it takes a good few years actually. But I do think that then comes a point where when you know a country too well, you sort of stop recognizing what's interesting.
Mm.
You need fresh eyes. So I definitely felt like that point had come. Um, the earthquake was a big moment for me as well
Yeah.
in 2023. So the city that was entirely destroyed, Antakya, I actually lived there for 8 months when I first moved to Turkey because I was reporting in Syria at that time. Um, I mean, it was just utterly discombobulating and horrifying to see that city totally I mean, I couldn't recognize it, right? I couldn't find my way around. And then of course Istanbul also lies on a fault line and the buildings are of the same construction and quality of the
Mhm.
ones that collapsed. So yeah, I found it very, very difficult to sort of keep living in Istanbul after that. Yeah, and Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, Turkey's a country that I love very much and I spent my whole 30s there. I have many friends there, but it's not the same place that I moved to and the same place that you knew, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Um, I really saw the sort of how a corrupt leadership can corrupt the whole country there. It's become a place where, in order to succeed, you almost have to be sort of on the side of bad. This sounds very sort of, I don't know. Obviously, there are still very, very good people there, but it's not for nothing that most Turks that you speak to are trying to find a way to leave these
Mm,
days.
mm,
And I always have felt, and particularly, since I've lived in Turkey and reported in troubled places, I'm incredibly lucky to have been born in Britain with a British passport
hmm hmm
to have this country to come back to. Um, and I did miss London. Yeah. London's another city that I love very dearly. And it's fairly interesting times here as well. So I really
Well,
felt like it was time.
I've lost track of how many prime ministers you've had in the last 10 years. I think we're on number seven, I think.
We are. We
Yeah.
are. Let's see how long this one lasts.
And I shouldn't say we because as it, well, you, but because, as you know, I was born in Bournemouth on the south coast of England and uh, left to come to Canada with my mum and dad when I was 10 years old. But on the question of Turkey, I find the country fascinating. It is as your book Hinterlands says very clearly. When you're in Istanbul, and I'm paraphrasing what you said. When you're in Istanbul, you get a heads up of what is going to be changing in the region, and it will affect much more than the region, right? Um, it's a den of spies, as you also say, and you can go back certainly to Second World War. I've read so much Midnight at the Para Palace,
Right.
books like that. And I know many of the people listening in today have traveled to Turkey. I think this year, certainly last year, this year we'll have the most Canadian tourists that have traveled to Turkey
Wow.
um, than ever before. So you do see a genuine interest in the country and hope for its future. But of course, there are challenging times throughout the region. So I do see that we're past 12 o'clock, and I could carry on because there's so much more to talk about. But I think we'll call our chat to we'll bring it to an end now. But I'll give you the last word. Hinterlands has just come out this week in North America. So, any last words for our audience before we say goodbye today, Hannah?
Well, thank you very much for joining to everyone. And yeah, no, I think more than anything, it's been a total sort of privilege as a journalist to be reporting on this region at such a time. I was lucky enough to land in Istanbul just at the moment that that region became hugely important and hugely interesting.
Mhm.
And, you know, as journalists, I think some people characterize as adrenaline junkies, which I think we are to a certain extent. But what we all want to do is kind of witness history. And I really felt like I did that many times over in the time that I was there.